Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. It's Tuesday, February 8th, 2022. Today, we're going to hear from the second of three postdoctoral fellows in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences. The third will be a week from today on February 15th. And to tell us a little bit more about the Idaho Society of Fellows and to introduce today's speaker, I'd like to welcome the Dean of the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences, Dr. Sean Quinlan.
Thank you, Kenton, and thank everyone for being here. Very much appreciated. I wanted to say just a quick two words about the Society of Fellows and introduce today's speaker. The past years, the University of Idaho created the Idaho Society of Fellows. It is housed in our College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences, and the Society constitutes a new initiative to broaden the sphere of interdisciplinary and collaborative research in the humanities and social sciences across our campus, and is a big part of our R1 aspirations in the college. Each year, the Society recruits 3 postdoctoral fellows for 2-year appointments. The fellows teach in the undergraduate and graduate curriculum, and they otherwise engage in the research and participate in the academic life of the college. The postdoctoral fellowships provide professional support and development and work closely with faculty mentors and graduate students, and they engage in interdisciplinary research initiatives, programming across the campus. And the fellowships themselves are generously funded by existing endowments within the college and partnership with the Office of Research and Economic Development. And just want to give really big thanks to President Green, who supported the initiative and was so enthusiastic about it all the way down the line. Last week, we met one of the first fellows, Joseph Feldman. Next week, we'll be meeting Cody Trojan, and it's my very great pleasure today to be able to introduce Kerri Clement. Kerri Clement, who's one of the postdoctoral fellows in the society. She did her undergraduate work in Montana and completed her doctorate at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Her work is specialized in the history of zoonotic disease, animals, indigenous and settler borderlands, particularly in Montana and the Yellowstone regions. She's held numerous prestigious fellowships and grants from places such as the Newberry Library, the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine at the University of Colorado, and the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, among others. Her talk today is entitled Post-War Anti-Statism in Montana Ranching Communities, and it's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce her and to have her as a member of the society. So thank you, Kerri, for speaking today.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'll see if I can get this going. So briefly, thanks again for having me, and thanks again for listening to me give this talk today. As a quick outline, what I'm going to talk about is just a brief case study within my greater book project as a whole. This is one of the more intriguing case studies that I've come across, particularly relevant, I think, to our current political climate for a variety of unfortunate reasons. But I will say quickly that this is a work in progress. And my overall book project is about the interplay between settler colonial borders, conflicting sovereignties and jurisdictions relative to zoonotic disease management. In particular, the story of, and I will explain this disease more in a moment, but in particular, the story of the disease Brucellosis in bison on the Crow Reservation in Montana and in Yellowstone. So for a quick outline for my talk today, I'm going to try and give enough background information to understand why this case study is intriguing to me. I'll talk briefly about the case study, and then I'll give a brief moment for closing thoughts and questions. And so just keep an eye on my time here. Okay, so quickly, brucellosis, which is the disease I'm going to in question today. And brucellosis is a bacterial disease that can and does infect mammals. It is now including humans, It is now a fairly rare disease, particularly amongst humans in the modern United States. But one of the reasons it's now rare is because it's one of the most heavily regulated diseases within agricultural sectors. This is because humans can catch brucellosis through interactions with other mammals, typically through eating, drinking, or processing animal products. And if humans can catch it, it can cause flu-like symptoms, which, because it can cause flu-like symptoms, unless a medical provider is aware to test for the disease, it can often stick around for years and years and years, and can cause like years of suffering. For example, one of the women who really identified this disease as being this particular disease in 1918, she suffered from this disease for decades and decades and decades before it was properly diagnosed. She likely caught it from one of her experiments. When animals catch it, particularly large mammals like bovines, like cattle or bison, it can cause spontaneous abortions in pregnant females. That symptom is probably the main reason why agricultural producers in the late 1800s and early 1900s really began to pay attention to the disease, because it can, affect cattle crops, or it can affect calf crops. But wild animals can catch it too, pretty much any mammal. It is found within bison and elk within and around the Yellowstone area, but then in also other wild populations in the United States. The regulation of the disease itself is a very complicated backstory. And so what I'm going to attempt to do for the next several minutes is try and give the backstory for the state of Montana, while trying to include somewhat some of the national context that is relevant to the state of Montana. The reason why I was interested in the state of Montana in particular is because of its effect on the Yellowstone story, and how the brucellosis control measures around Yellowstone bison can and do affect the relationship between the state of Montana and Yellowstone National Park. However, today what I'm going to be talking about more in particular is the Montana Stock Growers and Montana Association, as well as the Montana Cattlemen industry more broadly, or the Montana cattle industry more broadly. To do that, first what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of background into the Montana Stock Growers Association. So like other stock grower, or like other cattle ranching regions within the United States, in the late 19th and earlier 20th century, cattle producers, some of them are called cattle barons due to their national and international economic and political power, played controlling roles in early politics in the state. These stockmen and their organizations, like the Montana Stock Growers Association, which was formed in 1884, helped to create territorial and state livestock agencies specifically directed at controlling epizoonotic diseases and zoonotic diseases as well. For example, one fairly famous cattle baron by the name of Conrad Coors, his ranch is now a national park, sponsored a bill in the 1885 legislature to fund a territorial veterinarian, and authorize that veterinarian to slaughter animals for only the purpose of disease eradication. So he was essentially, and the bill was approved, essentially saying that this one person had the ability to slaughter anyone's property in the name of controlling for diseases. While there was some compensation for producers if that happened, it was still a fairly drastic step to take. The reason why states like Montana and Conrad Coors in this specific instance wanted these veterinarians, and then later larger control boards to have this power is because in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was a variety of zoonotic disease quarantines, or quarantines aimed at controlling for these diseases that animals, particularly livestock, carry, especially from Canada and Great Britain. And we're at that, and those quarantines were centered on the importation and exportation of cattle and horses. Often these quarantines were enforced by the US military, and in some cases the Rocky Mountain Canadian, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And this greatly interfered with cattle producers' ability to get their stock to market, to say nothing of being able to slaughter them. In response to those quarantines, livestock producers really got very anxious. And so they really began to clamor for local control to eradicate these diseases, so that these federal quarantines, or these international quarantines in many cases, could be lifted. At the federal level, or I should say rather at the national level, the stockmen lobbied for the creation of a specific agency, and they were successful when the Bureau of Animal Industry was created by the United States Congress in the 1880s. Several decades later, in 1907, Montana created the Livestock Sanitary Board, and that effort was led by cattle barons, but then also the Montana Stock Growers Association, which by that time was one of the most powerful political organizations in the state of Montana. Pretty famous members included people like Teddy Roosevelt, but it also included folks like many governors. It included very powerful folks in early Montana politics. It included mining magnates, etc. And so the Montana Stock Growers Association really pushed for the creation of livestock sanitary, what they called the Livestock Sanitary Board. However, I shouldn't say however, brucellosis wasn't one of the main diseases that they were concentrating on yet, partly because it wasn't on their radar, because science hadn't really identified it yet. They were concentrating largely on diseases like bovine tuberculosis. They were concentrating on diseases like scabies mites. They were, however, beginning to fight brucellosis in small fashion, or rather, they were beginning to work to control it. As I said earlier, the spontaneous abortion factor symptom, rather, of the disease was a problem. And that was the main reason why they were concentrating on it, because there wasn't any quarantines on it just yet. However, that would change as scientific attention on the disease grew after Alice Evans identified the disease in 1918, 1919, and greater national and international attention on the disease grew in the 1920s and 1930s. But the bacterial disease itself would prove to be a difficult opponent. And in many ways, the fight over brucellosis regulations, particularly following World War II, would demonstrate how the Montana Stock Growers Association itself would sort of face challenges to its pretty strong power dynamics and power and control within both the political and economic sectors within the state of Montana. So between 1944, so to fast forward past World War II, following World War II, the attention and the national attention against brucellosis, or rather to fight brucellosis, really grew in the United States. And so what ends up happening on the national level is there's a massive shift over a fairly short period of time between 1946 to about 1953, 55, where the United States national disease boards shift from just simply controlling brucellosis to full-on eradicating it. And there's several reasons for that, not the least of which is they were successful in controlling and eradicating a few other diseases. And so there was some thought that if they can do that with those diseases, they can do that with brucellosis, which the fact that we still have that in some form or fashion today is sort of demonstrates that that's not true. That wasn't true. But what ends up happening is at the federal level, there's these huge pushes towards creating and implementing really draconian regulations in order to control for brucellosis. And the Montana Livestock Sanitary Board, as well as the Montana Stock Growers Association. So what you see there is a government board in the form of the Livestock Sanitary Board, and then a trade group in the form of the Stock Growers Association. So technically a non-government organization, even though in some ways and fashion it functioned as a government organization. You see those two groups, a trade group and a government organization, joining together to support those more draconian regulations because they wanted to be able to qualify for what was called modified certified status. And I'll explain that modified certified status here in a moment. But what ends up happening is the cattlemen within the state of Montana begin to push back against that. And in many ways, the opposition that those cattlemen exhibit sort of reflect later anti-statism ideology and activism, for example, that would be seen potentially in the Sagebrush Rebellion in the 1870s and the 1880s. Really quickly, the Sagebrush Rebellion was a movement that supported transferring public land from federal to state control to reclaim grazing rights and promote economic development. It was largely in the Western United States, including Montana. Sagebrush rebels then also would later contribute to other anti-government movements in the West, such as the Montana Militia Group in the 1990s, and several uprisings against regulations and grazing regulations, in particular in Western states, as well as occupations of federal lands by sovereign citizens that we've seen in more recent years. But what they were reacting to, and I'll get more into that reaction here in a moment, but as these more draconian measures were implemented, this Livestock Sanitary Board, the Montana government, and the Montana Stock Growers Association were essentially placed in a position where they were advocating for these draconian measures. These measures included advocating for a brand new vaccine against brucellosis. And the vaccine for brucellosis was, had been around for about a decade or so. By the 1950s. It was, but it was brand new, and there was some doubt as to whether or not it actually worked, about its efficacy. And so board officials for both the stock growers and the state of Montana had to step up their public education campaigns for these stockmen. And officials were also fighting against several pervasive myths about brucellosis. Several of the myths included the fact that it wasn't microbial in nature. It was, but some thought it was a result of mineral deficiency. And then stockmen had pretty deep set doubts about whether or not the vaccine was sustainable, both economically, but then also within their herds and their vaccination plans for their herds. Officials often justified both the adoption of some of these draconian measures, including vaccination requirements, mandatory vaccination requirements, by drawing on economic justifications. One extension agent described brucellosis as, quote, a robber of livestock profits. And so economics was a huge part of the reason why these livestock officials wanted the cattlemen to essentially fall in line with these regulations. They could also take part of federal subsidies for vaccinations and federal subsidies for like greater implementation of these regulations. It's also worth noting that these regulations required test and slaughter. And test and slaughter was a method. It's still in employment in some forms or fashions for some disease regulations, including brucellosis. But test and slaughter is test for the disease, and if an animal is a reactor to the test, or it is counted as a positive case and is slaughtered. In some cases, the entire herd is slaughtered, or was slaughtered. It's both and there in terms of the present tense. And so when they were trying to advocate for these stockmen to fall in line with these regulations, they were advocating for them to follow a dual methods control system. And there was some success, and there were some stockmen who fell in line, if you will. For example, Lake County, which encompasses part of the Flathead Indian Reservation, or the now CSKT Reservation in Northwest Montana, became the first in the state to adopt it in 1950, and they were declared clean essentially by 2 years later. So, but it required testing every single one of the herd multiple times within the county, slaughtering any reactors, and replacing those positive herds with clean herds. So it was a fairly large undertaking. But because there was that one case study or successful case study in Lake County early on, the Livestock Sanitary Board was like, well, we can do this across the whole state. Brucellosis must go, they declare in 1952. And so other counties, and so they begin this big campaign to support the adoption of these, or rather the following of these regulations. Other Montana counties begin to sort of fall in line. And by 1954, 14 additional counties have been declared brucellosis free. And when a county is declared brucellosis free, they're called certified status, or they've been called certified free. And when a county was in the process of becoming certified free, they would be called modified certified. By 1956, the board had declared 22 counties as modified certified, and it seemed as though the livestock board and the Montana stock growers had successfully set Montana on the road to brucellosis eradication. But because national regulations depended on dual methods of both test and slaughter and vaccinations, it created large schisms in the livestock industry, like I had alluded to earlier, especially within the Montana Stock Growers Association. In 1957, a group of powerful stockmen broke with the Stock Growers Association and formed another livestock trade group called the Montana Cattlemen's Association. One of the leading organizers of the Cattlemen's Association was Art Watson, who you can see him quoted in the newspaper clipping here. He was a former two-term legislator, and other prominent organizers included a former state representative, then current chairman of the Montana's Democratic Party, and grandnephew of Montana's first governor. In later decades, these leaders of the livestock organizations chopped the split up to more than just brucellosis control, but their writings from the time cite brucellosis control measures and brucellosis eradication measures as one of the main, if not the main reason for the split from the Stock Growers Association. The producers who split from the stock growers thought that the brucellosis regulations laid out by national regulations were, quote, high-handed and arbitrary. The stock growers, however, they thought they were high-handed and arbitrary because the stock growers supported the dual method control of test and slaughter and mandatory vaccination. The Cattlemen Association, so the group that split, conversely wanted mandatory vaccinations, but not test and slaughter. Here's why they didn't want that. Because the vaccine could cause a positive test. So a newly tested cow or a newly vaccinated cow could cause a positive reaction, which according to the regulations would mean that she would be slaughtered. And so the cattlemen felt as though it was expensive and unnecessary to use both methods if vaccination was compulsory, because the new brucellosis vaccine could cause the false positives. And so there was the thinking, well, if we're having the vaccine and the vaccine is mostly effective, why would we want to slaughter positive reactors that potentially aren't infected with the disease in the first place? But the cattlemen weren't the only split from the stock growers over brucellosis. The stock growers also had another split that occurred in 1958, where stockmen from Montana and actually Wyoming, South Dakota, and North Dakota as well met in Miles City, so in the eastern part of the state, and formed a non-state sanctioned disease control agency. So they started to form their own disease control agency, even though it was not sanctioned by the state, called the Stockmen's Disease Control Association. The majority of the members hailed from eastern Montana and the bordering states. And when we look at that combined with the Cattlemen's Association, it represents a serious challenge to the organization, to the Stock Growers Association's long-held power within Montana politics and the Montana economic and the Montana economy. Stockmen from both the Cattlemen's Association and from the newly formed Stockmen's Disease Control Association wanted faster and more concrete results than could be attained through just lobbying. And in particular, for the Montana or the Stockmen's Disease Control Association, or the SDCA, the attendees and the members of that group stated that the purpose of the group was beyond just to be a trade group, but to work towards a practical control of livestock disease, end quote, because it opposed the Montana government's, and here are their words, uncooperative, dictatorial, bureaucratic control of its so-called eradication program, end quote. Just as a side note, this must have been a very, very awkward meeting because the lead veterinarian for the state, as well as the chief veterinarian for brucellosis control for the USDA on the federal level, both attended the meeting, likely to try and dissuade the meeting attendees from creating the group that they did create. In later documents, the SDCA lambasted both state and federal regulations, saving special ire and for test and slaughter, like the Montana Cattlemen's Association, the group who styled themselves as progressive and practical ranchers wanted to rely solely on calf hood vaccination for protection against brucellosis. The SDCA attacked testing as an outdated concept because of the rise of vaccination. And they thought using taxpayer dollars to force unwilling ranchers to test their animals was unnecessary. The SDCA's opposition to testing in combination with vaccination was, as I mentioned, because of the vaccine's high rate of false positives. And like I said earlier, a producer stood to lose breeding cows if a cow tested as a false positive. The rate of that happening, though, it is worth mentioning, was about was about 2 in every 100,000 calves. So it's a very low occurrence, with the rate increasing slightly with the age of the cow. Even the efficacy of the vaccine, though, it's also worth noting, to further complicate the situation, was quite variable, with the vaccine only offering about between 82 to 95% only protection, and it was dependent on the amount of bacteria the cow was exposed to within the vaccine dosage. But due to national regulations requirements, a false positive meant the destruction of a vaccinated animal, like I said. For producers, particularly producers who are members of the SDCA, who did brisk interstate business, because, you know, being in Eastern Montana, they were closer to, say, you know, major stockyards in South Dakota or major stockyards in Kansas than they were major stockyards in Montana. A false positive would mean that they couldn't trade out of state because it would actually lose their county's modified, certified, or even certified free status. So they saw, or they rather perceived, their right to freely move and market cattle across political boundaries as superseding the state of Montana's authority to stamp out brucellosis. In other words, or rather, the SDCA's beef with the government extended beyond brucellosis policies, which they saw literally as overkill. The SDCA also sort of saw itself as defending American liberty and freedom. The group called federal and state agencies as ill-advised and over-solicitous, and assailed the soaring expense of brucellosis control measures as a violation of the national constitution. The group assessed the brucellosis situation with a very dire predicament, that it, quote, will only be a matter of time until the remaining free segments of our present social structure will be sold to the complete will of socialism by the use of their own tax dollars, thus relinquishing their few remaining rights to the conduct of their own business and personal living to some, I am reading this verbatim, super intelligence devoted to protecting everyone against himself, end quote. So what I find interesting about that quote is it's not just relegated to anger against the state of Montana for following national brucellosis controls. There's some interesting language that I see paralleling later anti-government movements beyond just sounding like some ill-advised Facebook rant. These comments showed how the association portrayed its members as righteous patriots, fighting a just war against socialism and government overreach. The SDCA's hyperbolic language connecting vaccines and test and slaughter to free market enterprise and constitutional rights revealed how the stockmen viewed themselves as stalwart heroes against bloated and overreaching government agencies. I haven't been able to find yet where the SDCA adopted this free market language and citizenry rights rhetoric, but it does reference how other states and national trade groups had similar resistance movements against brucellosis regulation. So in other words, they saw themselves as a part of a greater movement on a national scale against national overreach. The SDCA, like I mentioned earlier, didn't see political lobbying as the answer. They took concrete action in 1959 when one of its members filed a lawsuit in Montana as a test case. The rancher from Eastern Montana named A.G. Lee, who was actually named by one of Montana's senators several years ago recently as one of like a Montana hero. Lee's filed a lawsuit in Montana court named A.G. Lee. Lee's suit was supported by the SDCA, and it charged that the Livestock Sanitary Board lacked the power to declare a county's brucellosis status based on uncertainty of deciding who counted as a livestock producer and therefore who could participate in the program, or who could vote, or who could be counted as, or who could be counted against the county's brucellosis status, excuse me. What is interesting is that a large part of the rhetoric against brucellosis regulations coming from this group was against, federal overreach, and yet they filed it in Montana court. But the case bounced around between the Montana District Court and the Montana Supreme Court several times, due in part to poorly written briefs from the SDCA. Finally, in 1960, the state Supreme Court upheld the Montana government's Livestock Sanitary Board authority to enforce animal disease regulations in the areas already being enforced in, but stated that the board cannot impose the classification on an area that was not already signed onto the program. The court decision was not a clear win or loss for either side. It nonetheless seems to have placated the SDCA because the organization appeared to file no additional litigation. And after that, after the 1960 decision, the SDCA and its members, including A.G. Lee, sort of fade from newspaper and government records after the lawsuit. The Montana Cattlemen's Association, though, the first group that split from the stock growers, is still around to this day. Nevertheless, even though the SDCA has sort of faded from the picture, the anti-government attitudes expressed by the group would be mirrored by producers and activists in later years with other movements, like the Sagebrush Rebellion. However, I should note, it is difficult to say whether or not the SDCA directly contributed to the Sagebrush Rebellion or later anti-government or anti-statist actions in the American West. There are some key differences, especially the fact that the SDCA organized against a Montana government organization rather than just the federal government. Whereas later Sagebrush rebels would organize primarily to support state government or private folks taking public land. But the timing of the litigation, as well as the language of the group used by the group, is evidence that the SDCA was an early example of growing resentment and anger towards government regulation in the livestock industry in the West. Furthermore, the fact that livestock disease regulations was the catalyst that carried forward the SDCA's anti-government rhetoric reveals a noteworthy causative factor for anti-government sentiments in the American West. In other words, whereas many scholars of anti-government movements have correctly identified contributing factors to the Sagebrush Rebellion, like grazing regulations, fear of environmentalist movements, and religion, the SDCA story demonstrates that livestock producer resistance to animal disease control regulations must be added to the list of contributing factors for the rise in anti-government sentiments. It's also worth noting that for the SDCA in particular, freer movements over borders, both county but particularly state, due to where they lived within a geographic region, was a key component of its proposed remedies to government overreach. Many SDCA, like I said, members sold their stock in other states. Governmental oversight of shipping regulations and the ability to move cattle meant something to them. So in other words, if they had a modified certified status or even a less than modified certified status, they had a much more difficult time sending their cattle to market. Thus, the SDCA represented a sort of precocious rebellion against the growing rigidity of border control as a core strategy for brucellosis eradication. What's ironic is that it was some of these same producers, or even their descendants, who would later sort of bellow most loudly against bison migration out of Yellowstone Park, a situation in which the state of Montana would jump at the chance to enforce its border power over migrating animals. In other words, the same producers who oppose rigid borders to control brucellosis, or to eradicate brucellosis, would turn around only a few decades later and demand rigid border control to stop brucellosis. It's also worth noting that both the Cattlemen's and the Stock Growers Association would support sagebrush rebel bills in Montana. In fact, the Montana Stock Growers Association, from whom the Cattlemen and the SDCA split, would be the one to support, would be the one to both write and then have their both write and then sponsor sagebrush rebel bills within Montana legislature, which would ultimately fail. Yet in the 1960s, but regardless of later sagebrush rebel issues, and I'll wrap up here in a moment to take questions and comments. In the end, though, despite the A.G. Lee lawsuit and the SDCA's sort of very inflammatory rhetoric, as well as the Montana Cattlemen's Association creation of a new group, the Livestock Sanitary Board continued its work in certifying Montana counties as brucellosis free, partly because Montana was lagging behind the rest of the country and thus faced increasing federal restrictions on out-of-state travel of Montana's cattle. Largely, the board's efforts seem to have worked. During the early 1960s, the numbers of brucellosis infected cattle herds dropped fairly dramatically across Montana. And by 1964, so only 4 years after the conclusion of the lawsuit, the entire state was a modified certified area, which eased shipping restrictions on producers moving cattle to and from the state. But the resentment continued to smolder amongst livestock producers, as did brucellosis. Both the disease and the resentment would continue to reappear with a vengeance in the coming decades. Thank you for your patience and listening with me today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kerri, for that informative and fascinating presentation. It's a bit of Western agricultural history that I didn't know, and I think might produce some interesting comments and questions. And we already have a long comment from Nancy Cheney in the chat and dealing with mistrust in government as a variable in COVID vaccination rates and severity of outbreaks. And Nancy, would you like to just unmute yourself and perhaps condense your question for the benefit of the audience and for our speaker?
Sure. Thank you, Kerri, for your presentation today. I appreciated that. As an advocate for the One Health initiative, which addresses zoonotic diseases such as brucellosis, I do see this mistrust of government as kind of emblematic of some of the pitfalls that diagnosticians and practitioners of human and veterinary medicine encounter when trying to address this. There are some tests that can be done without the identification and slaughter that you described for false positives in these. And so my chat entry concerns a couple of articles that appeared, and this is associated with the National Institutes of Health. So it's a reliable source that you might find informative if you're not already aware of it.
Yeah, thank you. And as I'm sure you're aware that, like, to give the entirety of a disease history regulation in one talk is really difficult. Since this disagreement within the Montana cattlemen's industry occurred. There's been, even further draconian, what they would call draconian measures implemented. But yeah, how to couch these regulations within and how to find sort of a middle ground is very difficult. So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Other questions or comments or observations?
So I have one, Kerri, that's not necessarily, it's only tangentially related to the content, which is, did you come across the name Leuthold at all in any of your research? Leuthold?
I'm not thinking of it off the top of my head, but there were so many names and acronyms that I'll have to go back and I'll have to check for it. I can do that.
The reason I ask is that's my great uncle, and the family owns 13,000 acres of ranch right outside Billings. My great uncle was a state legislator for 16 years and a member of the Montana Stock Growers Association, among other things. So it just seemed like his name would probably have come up somewhere. And so I never thought I would say that I would ask a family history question in related to cattle disease, but there you go.
So Sarah Nelson, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away, please.
Hi, Kerri. You did a fascinating job of telling this story, and let's see. It struck me that I was just hearing this morning on the radio reference back to the 2014 armed standoff at the Bundy Ranch in Nevada, and I'm just wondering if you happen to know anything about sort of like branching roots between this kind of pushback against health regulations, and then you did mention the Sagebrush Rebellion and how that kind of interacted. And do you know anything about the sort of the Bundy branch of anti-statist thinking, and if it connects at all with what you've been telling us about?
So I haven't found a direct connection between the Bundys and some of these Montana, I would even call them quasi sagebrush rebels, because in many ways there's this sort of fathers of the sons who would become the actual sagebrush rebels within the state of Montana in the 70s and 80s, although the generational thing is a little tricky. I haven't found any direct connections, like for in the same way that Lavoy Finicum would be a direct connection now between Montana and some of the Bundys. But I do think it's noteworthy to mention that, particularly for, say, for example, some of the Sagebrush Rebellion organizations or conferences that were created in Utah in the 1970s, or that were attended in Utah in the 1970s and 80s, that many of these sagebrush rebels sort of got their information from, and then they went back to their home states and started sponsoring all of these sagebrush rebel bills, were many of the same people who were living through the Bundy stuff, or who were, let me stop. They were going to the same conferences. These same people were going to the same conferences from both Utah and Nevada, and then from Montana. It's the same folks. So I haven't found and this is where, like, in digital humanities, I would call, you would call it a strong tie. I haven't found the direct, but there's some weak ties there that I think are really interesting. In my future research, I hope to really sort of explore that a lot more. I think I've only scratched the surface with this. That is definitely a question I would really like to have answered to a greater degree, because I think it's a really significant one. So thank
you
you
very much.
I don't know if that was satisfactory. But-
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
So Professor Schofield has a question.
Thank you so much, Kerri, for sharing. I knew your research was amazing, but this was pretty mind-blowing to see how well it connects to conversations today. I'm wondering, in that kind of commentary about socialism and how, like, no matter what, like what we're talking about in the West, like somehow someone connects it to socialism, and especially when you're thinking about stock grower associations, like in a lot of ways, these are groups of people who come together cooperatively to work together to, address industry issues or inequalities, those sort of things. But then they also like have this really anti-socialist rhetoric. And I'm wondering, when you see those conversations happening, is it like, are they actually afraid of socialism within like an industry context? Or are they simply using that as like a stand-in to talk about any sort of what they would deem government overreach? Because I'm baffled by the use of this term in Western history.
That's a great question. I don't fully know the answer to that. And I think the way I would find the answer to that is to figure out where they adopted this rhetoric in the first place, particularly in relation to the free market ideology. I think it's a little bit of using it as a straw man argument, but I think it's also noteworthy to note, it's also noteworthy that it is happening within the context of this, the Cold War. So I think it's a little bit of both and situation in that case of using it in a bad faith argument, but then also I think they truly sort of see themselves as, or truly saw themselves, as sort of the stalwart patriots. It is interesting to note that in a lot of their documents, particularly for the SDCA, the Montana Cattlemen's Association, not so much, but the SDCA in particular, I wasn't kidding when I said it read like a Facebook rant. It had misspellings, it had all caps yelling, it had about 6 exclamation points of a paragraph, if there was such thing as a paragraph. And so there was sort of this interesting moment of, I think there of just some really anti-establishment, maybe even, goes deeper than just government, anti-statism, but like anti-establishment sort of anger being expressed there. Yeah, I do think that their commentary about socialism is really, really interesting, particularly because like within the larger US agricultural market within that time period, they're dealing with embargoes against, or potentially threatened embargoes, but then also potentially opening up of the greater agricultural market from, Argentinian beef as well as Canadian beef. And so they're trying to like both keep this nationalism and national industry intact while still selling to some of these international markets. It's really very like have their cake and eat it too sort of a situation.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I feel like all the time I read about people who are, the sons or grandsons of people who like helped found Granges, which are very socialist. And that sort of like populist streak in Idaho was so strong of like, we should nationalize the railroads. And then like, 2 generations, they're like down with socialism. I'm like, well, your granddaddy kind of liked it a little bit. So it's very interesting to see how this kind of plays out. And I liked what you said about the larger context of the Cold War and how that really shifted that, or even just, by the time we get to the Bolshevik Revolution, it goes from like, it's totally okay to be a socialist. You can run for president as a socialist. And then the Bolshevik Revolution is like, nope, nope, we've never been socialist ever. We don't like that. So yeah, I think that's I would love to riff with you sometime on the rhetorics of conservative Westerners.
I'm not seeing any other hands. So Kerri, I'd like to ask somewhat of a tangential question that'll take you beyond your own research. One of the nominees for an Academy Award for Best Picture is The Power of the Dog, a film based on a novel set in Montana in the 1920s on a cattle ranch, but actually filmed on the South Island of New Zealand. And I'm curious, first, have you seen the film? And second, did anything in it resonate with your own research about animal diseases in Montana cattle country?
So unfortunately, I haven't seen the film yet. I sort of vaguely know the story of it though, right? Because it's like, spoiler alert, it's the idea that he was he was sort of purposefully infected with anthrax or something like that. Yeah. What's interesting and is anthrax was one of the diseases that was targeted by the Montana livestock, by the sanitary board, so the Montana government branch of the disease regulation or disease eradication. What's interesting though, it's largely a different group of stock growers that were associated with it. So some of a large, and particularly within the last 50 years, most of the folks who have been dealing with some of the anthrax regulations tend to be sheep growers. Mm-hmm. So for example, I have a family friend who, raised sheep in a certain ranch in Montana since the 1870s, and they had to get rid of their sheep in 2006. And they were heritage breeds and everything because of anthrax. So I should watch the movie. I just haven't been able to quite sit down and make myself do it yet. So
Becca, you were nodding when I mentioned the film. Have you seen it? And
no,
observation.
I just dropped in the chat that I've also been avoiding it because it's a quote unquote gay cowboy movie, and it just feels like I'm doing my job. So I've been like trying to work myself up to doing my job in the evening by watching that. But yes, Kerri and I maybe we'll host a watch.
Yeah. Well, I'll be interested in both of your impressions when you have found time to watch it, and particularly how well you think Central Otago in the middle of the South Island passes for the range and valleys of Montana. I'm told that the filmmakers spent a lot of time trying to find compatible terrain to make it look like Montana, but those of you who have spent time in the state probably have a better sense of how accurate that depiction is. So, Kerri, I also wonder about what was going on in Idaho. You mentioned Wyoming and the Dakotas, and I wondered, was there a similar anti-animal disease regulation movement among Idaho cattlemen, or was that less significant, at least at the times of your study?
That's a great question. I don't know Idaho necessarily in depth to answer it fully. What I can say safely is that every single state in the United States had anti-brucellosis regulation movements. In some cases, in some states, particularly who had really raging infections of brucellosis, or I should say really widespread and pretty endemic cases of brucellosis. So for example, Florida and Texas had really bad rates. Actually sued the federal government constantly. And it wasn't even until the 1970s and 1980s where all of that sort of was settled down. But I do think I don't know Idaho fairly in depth. I do know that there was some correspondence between the Montana Stock Growers Association and the Montana Livestock Sanitary Board with Idaho. But not, interestingly enough, to the same degree that, for example, Wyoming or South Dakota was. And I think my guess would be that's a symptom of, if I can use that word, the location of the major stockyards. So, and where Montana's cattle were being sent. Largely, if Montana's cattle were being shipped west, they were all headed to either Spokane or Seattle. So, yeah, you see more, or I would see more conversation around brucellosis with Idaho around the buffalo in the 80s, in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Well, that's
good question.
A good topic for another graduate student's future research, and certainly your material would be a good starting point for anybody who wanted to look at Idaho or the other Northwest states. So thank you for that tip. We've come to the bottom of the hour, and it's time to wrap up. And so before I give a preview of next week's talk, I'd like to invite the audience to either put up your hands on camera or just the hand in the corner of the Zoom screen to thank our speaker for her time and expertise. And we look forward to your continued contributions to the history department and the college during your time as a member of the Society of Fellows.
Thank
and
you.
As Dean Quinlan mentioned, next week's talk will be the third of 3 by the postdocs in our college. And the speaker is Dr. Cody Trojan, who's affiliated with the Department of Politics and Philosophy. Cody was in the audience today. He'll be speaking about the problem of anachronism in public law and political theory. And if you're on the Renfrew mailing list, you'll get an abstract and a short bio of the speaker later this week. So thanks everybody for your participation today. I hope you'll join us next week. And I should alert you that 2 weeks from today will be during Jazz Festival week. And if all goes according to plan, we will have an in-person program featuring the Palouse Jazz Project as a preview to the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival. So we'll break out of the Zoom mold for a week and have a chance to see each other socially distanced in a face-to-face environment. So thank you again, Kerri. Thank you, Dean Quinlan. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and see you next week.